He heard it clearly, not as a distant sound or something easy to ignore, but as something precise and familiar, carried just enough across the space to reach him without drawing attention from anyone else nearby. The voice was not loud, and it was not repeated, yet it did not need to be, because the moment it reached him, his body registered it before his mind could process it, and for a brief second, everything around him seemed to lose its structure as the sound settled into place. He did not stop walking, and he did not turn his head, but the rhythm of his steps changed slightly, becoming more controlled, more deliberate, as if he had already understood something that required him to remain exactly as he was. The yard continued to move, prisoners crossing paths, guards maintaining their positions, and the routine unfolding without interruption. Yet for him, the moment had already shifted into something else entirely. Because the sound he had just heard did not belong to this place, and the decision not to turn around had already been made before the silence returned. The voice did not come again, yet its absence made it stronger, as he continued forward without changing direction, holding his posture steady while everything around him remained unaware that something had just happened. The prisoner moved with the rest of the group across the open yard, following the same controlled pace that had been set by the guards, while the space around him remained filled with low movement and distant sound, none of which demanded attention or interruption. He adjusted his steps slightly to avoid another prisoner crossing in front of him, then continued forward, his posture steady, his gaze directed ahead, and his hands positioned in a way that did not draw attention, maintaining the same controlled presence that had kept him unnoticed until that moment. The sound he had heard repeated itself in his mind with increasing clarity, not as an echo, but as a detail that refused to fade, carrying a familiarity that did not match anything within the environment around him, as if it had been placed into the moment from somewhere outside it. He did not turn, and he did not slow enough to stand out, but his awareness shifted completely, as his attention began to track the space behind him without using his eyes, relying instead on small changes in sound, movement, and presence that might confirm what he had already begun to suspect. A group of prisoners moved past him from the opposite direction, their footsteps crossing his path briefly before separating again, while a guard stood near the edge of the yard, observing without interference, creating a steady background that remained unchanged. The prisoner adjusted his position slightly, stepping to the side to maintain his path, then forward again, keeping his movement aligned with the others while maintaining a controlled distance from those around him, as if creating space without making it visible. The sound did not return, yet its absence did not reduce its presence, because it had already taken form within him, shaping the way he moved and the way he held his posture, as if turning around would confirm something that he had already chosen not to face. He continued forward, maintaining the same pace, the same direction, and the same outward composure, while internally the moment remained active, defined not by what was happening in front of him, but by what he had chosen not to acknowledge behind him. And as the yard continued its routine without interruption, the decision not to turn became more than a reaction, because it had already begun to define what he would do next, even before the moment had fully revealed itself. The prisoner continued moving forward with the same controlled pace, yet he began to adjust the rhythm of his steps in subtle ways, shortening one step slightly and extending the next, as if testing whether the sound behind him would shift in response, while maintaining the appearance of following the group without deviation. He shifted his position a fraction to the right, allowing a small gap to open between himself and the prisoner walking beside him, then narrowed that space again, using the movement around him as a way to sense any change that might confirm the presence he had detected without needing to turn his head. A guard crossed several paces ahead, pausing briefly before redirecting a group toward the far side of the yard, and the prisoner responded by adjusting his direction slightly, not to follow the instruction immediately, but to create a different angle within the same path, allowing him to alter his orientation without drawing attention. The ground beneath his steps changed as he moved across a worn section of the yard, and he used that shift in texture to slow his pace just enough to listen more closely, allowing the surrounding sounds to separate into layers, distinguishing between movement in front of him and the space behind. The voice did not repeat, yet something else replaced it, a faint adjustment in movement, a change in the pattern of footsteps that did not match the flow of the group, suggesting that someone behind him had altered their position at the same time he had changed his own. He responded by stepping slightly wider to the left, then forward again, maintaining his composure while increasing his awareness of the space behind him, tracking the distance through timing rather than sight, as if mapping the movement without directly observing it. A pair of prisoners passed between him and the area he had sensed, briefly interrupting the alignment of sound, and he adjusted again, slowing for a fraction of a second before resuming his pace, allowing the disturbance to clear while maintaining his direction. The guard's presence ahead created a fixed point, and the prisoner used it to maintain consistency in his movement, aligning his steps with the expected path while continuing to monitor the subtle changes occurring behind him, ensuring that nothing in his posture suggested awareness. The distance between him and the unseen presence appeared to remain constant, neither closing nor expanding significantly, yet the pattern of movement suggested intent rather than coincidence, as if the alignment had been established and was being maintained deliberately. He reached the edge of a wider section of the yard where the flow of prisoners began to spread out, and he adjusted his pace once more, allowing the space to open around him, creating a clearer field in which any change behind him would become more noticeable without requiring direct observation. And as the moment extended, the absence of a second call did not reduce the certainty of what he had heard, because the movement that followed it had already begun to confirm that the sound had not been accidental, and that whatever had reached him once was still present, positioned somewhere behind him, moving with the same awareness that now guided his own. The alignment of movement behind him began to shift in a way that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence, as the pattern he had been tracking through sound and timing adjusted slightly, suggesting that the distance was closing with deliberate control rather than remaining fixed within the natural flow of the yard. The prisoner maintained his pace without acceleration or hesitation, yet he altered the pressure of each step against the ground, allowing the contact to carry more information, separating the layered sounds around him from the single presence that continued to match his rhythm with increasing precision. A guard crossed his path at an angle, redirecting two prisoners toward another section, and in that moment, the prisoner adjusted his direction slightly, stepping to the side before continuing forward, using the disruption as a controlled test to see whether the presence behind him would respond. The response came through timing rather than sound alone, as the shift was mirrored with a slight delay, confirming that the movement behind him was not random, but reactive, maintaining alignment while adapting to every change he introduced. The prisoner allowed his shoulders to relax outwardly, preserving the appearance of routine movement, while internally he recalibrated his position, adjusting his path to pass closer to a group ahead, using their movement to create a temporary barrier that would force any follower to either break alignment or reveal intent. The group moved unpredictably, with one man slowing while another stepped forward, creating a brief disruption in the flow, and the prisoner used that moment to adjust his pace subtly before returning to a steady rhythm, continuing to track the presence behind him through timing alone. Despite the disruption, the pattern remained intact, as the distance between them did not collapse or expand unpredictably, but instead adapted smoothly, maintaining the same controlled alignment that suggested awareness rather than coincidence. The prisoner approached a narrower section between two structures where the open yard gave way to more confined movement, and as he entered this space, the sound of footsteps became clearer and more defined, allowing him to isolate the presence behind him with greater precision. He adjusted his pace again, slowing just enough to allow the space to compress, then continuing forward with the same controlled rhythm, creating a situation where any further approach would become unavoidable within the confined path. The presence behind him responded once more, maintaining alignment as the distance reduced slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to confirm that the approach had become intentional rather than passive. The prisoner did not turn and did not alter his posture, yet his awareness sharpened completely, as each step forward now carried the expectation that the distance would soon close into direct proximity without warning. A shadow crossed briefly along the structure beside him, matching the timing of the movement behind, and although he did not look, the confirmation was no longer necessary, because the alignment of sound, timing, and presence had already formed a complete and undeniable pattern. And as he moved deeper into the confined path, with the structure's limiting visibility and the movement around him fading, the moment reached a point where the next step would no longer maintain distance, but force the presence behind him into direct proximity, revealing itself without requiring him to turn around. The space behind him closed with a precision that could no longer be measured through distance alone, as the presence he had been tracking moved into a range where sound, timing, and movement aligned completely, creating a proximity that no longer needed confirmation. The prisoner continued forward with the same controlled pace, yet the pressure of awareness shifted fully into the immediate space behind him, as if the distance that had existed moments before had dissolved without warning, leaving only a narrow gap that could be crossed in a single step. He adjusted his stride slightly, not to escape or accelerate, but to stabilize his movement, ensuring that nothing in his posture suggested recognition, while his attention focused entirely on the exact position of the presence now moving within his immediate range. A faint shift in air followed, subtle yet distinct, as the space behind him changed in a way that could not be produced by distance alone, suggesting that the other man had entered directly into his path, aligning not just with his movement, but with his position. The prisoner maintained his forward direction, his gaze steady, his shoulders relaxed, and his hands controlled, holding the same outward composure while the internal tension reached its peak, as the moment approached a point where any reaction would immediately expose what had been concealed. The sound of footsteps behind him synchronized almost perfectly with his own, not matching exactly, but close enough to remove any remaining uncertainty, creating a pattern that confirmed the presence had moved into direct proximity rather than remaining at a distance. He shifted slightly to the side, allowing a fraction of space to open between himself and the structure beside him, not enough to change direction, but enough to create a subtle variation in his path, testing whether the presence would maintain alignment at this closer range. The adjustment was followed instantly, not through sound alone, but through the continuity of movement, as the alignment held even within the tighter space, confirming that the approach was fully controlled and intentional. A guard's voice echoed faintly from the yard behind them, followed by movement that did not reach into the confined path, leaving the two men within a space that felt separated from the rest of the camp, even though it remained fully exposed. The prisoner allowed one step to lengthen slightly, then returned to his original pace, maintaining the same rhythm while absorbing the final confirmation that the presence behind him was no longer distant, but directly within his immediate space. The moment stretched without interruption, as neither man broke the pattern, neither accelerated nor slowed enough to disrupt the alignment, holding a shared movement that required no acknowledgement, yet carried complete awareness from both sides. And as they continued forward within the narrow path, the situation reached its most fragile point, because the distance between them had disappeared entirely, leaving only a single step of separation, and any deviation from that controlled movement would transform the moment from silent recognition into something visible to everyone around them. The alignment between them continued for several more steps, held with a precision that no longer depended on distance, as both men maintained the same controlled rhythm, moving forward within the confined path without breaking the pattern that had brought them into direct proximity. The prisoner adjusted his stride slightly as the path ahead began to open, where the narrow space between the structures gave way to a wider section of the yard, and with that change, the moment reached a point where maintaining the alignment would no longer remain invisible. He responded by extending one step just enough to create a slight shift in timing, then returned to his original pace, allowing the smallest possible break to form in the pattern without turning or revealing awareness, as if introducing a controlled separation rather than forcing it. The presence behind him reacted with equal precision, not closing the gap immediately, but allowing the distance to expand by a fraction, maintaining awareness while releasing the exact alignment that had defined the movement within the confined space. The prisoner continued forward into the open section, adjusting his path slightly to the right as another group crossed ahead, using their movement to absorb the change, while the presence behind him altered direction in a different way, stepping slightly left and continuing along a separate line that reduced the connection to something no longer visible. The distance between them increased gradually, not abruptly, but through a series of small adjustments that restored the natural flow of the yard, allowing both men to re-enter the routine without leaving any trace of the alignment that had existed moments before. The prisoner maintained his posture and pace, merging into the movement of the group ahead, his gaze steady and his body controlled, as if nothing had shifted within him, while the other man continued in a different direction, disappearing into the same pattern of motion that defined the space. A guard passed between them at a distance, his presence briefly crossing the line that had once connected them, yet neither man reacted, holding their positions within the larger movement as if the moment had already been completed and required no continuation. The yard returned fully to its ordinary rhythm, with prisoners moving, guards observing, and the space carrying on without interruption, while the connection that had formed between the two men dissolved into the same routine that surrounded them. And as the distance expanded beyond recognition, the moment remained intact only through what had already taken place, because neither man had turned, neither had spoken, and neither had broken the silence that had defined the entire exchange, leaving behind an encounter that had existed completely, yet remained entirely unseen. The yard continued its movement without interruption, with prisoners crossing from one side to another and guards maintaining their positions, yet nothing within that routine reflected what had taken place between the two men, as the moment had formed, evolved, and disappeared without leaving any visible trace behind. The prisoner adjusted his pace to match the group ahead, maintaining the same posture and direction, while the space he had just passed through returned to its ordinary form, offering no sign that anything had occurred within it moments earlier. Somewhere behind him, now fully separated by distance and movement, the other man continued along a different path, blending into the same controlled rhythm of the camp, his presence no longer aligned, yet not erased from what had already been established. And although nothing had been spoken, nothing had been acknowledged, and nothing had been revealed to those around them, the moment remained complete in itself, defined not by action, but by restraint, and carried forward by both men without requiring confirmation. As time moved forward and the routine of the camp resumed its familiar structure, the encounter remained entirely unseen, yet fully intact, because it had never depended on visibility to exist, leaving behind a silent exchange that had been understood completely, even though it had never been allowed to surface. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.